The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
Today we're going to talk about three saints who are also supreme pontiffs, popes of the Church. And the first one we're going to talk about is Pius X. You know, oftentimes when we think of Pius X, we could almost visualize what he looks like. He's one of those early popes that we can actually put a face to. Mm-hmm. And he was born in 1835 and he died in 1914. He was the 259th Pope. There's some significant things about his life and his pontificate that we would like to share with the folks. What are some of those that really stand out in your mind?
Well, first, what's interesting about Pius and the other two saints that we will discuss is that they come from the 20th century. So, of course, we've had popes that are saints that go all the way through the history of the Church, but to focus today on the three of our time. Now, we could argue there aren't many of us that are alive, that were alive when he was walking the earth, but still, he didn't die until 1914, so we're talking just a little over 100 years ago. He understood then the early Church, or the Church of the early 20th century. Some of the things that he is most characterized with is a great devotion to the Eucharist and a great desire to spread that devotion to the Eucharist. And by what we mean by that is to give us really what is our current understanding of the reception of the Eucharist. It would be interesting for many people to know that the concept of just going to communion every time you went to Mass has only been in the last 100 plus few years of the Church. That is not what the vast majority of the Church did for most of our time. Coupling that with this idea of first communicants being our little second graders running around in veils and suits. We get that from Pius X. That was not part of the understanding of reception of the Eucharist either. So he really has given us our current picture of how we celebrate Eucharist.
What's interesting too is that he was someone, and we're talking about the early 20th century, and so we're just talking, you know, his pontificate is in the first really decade of that. Mm-hmm. And yet in his life there's this whole sense that he's combating those heresies that continue to find their way into the life of the Church. And so his whole sense was he's trying to, in the turn of the century, bring the Church not only into more modern times, but in understanding that sometimes the modern times can work against the Church and work against the faith. And sometimes modern things, heresies and heretics tend to creep in. So his really pontificate is dappled with all of this against heresy, against modernism, against those things that in the turn of the century, in this modern world, things tend to turn us away from the truths of the faith. And how important it is for us as Catholics to be rooted in those simple doctrines of the faith that give us a strong foundation and strong girth amidst the modernism that happens all around us.
Well, I think we see that kind of call in particular eras of the Church, but certainly in the time of Pius X, this sense of renewal or of moving forward. And sometimes it is because of a council that happens, like the Second Vatican Council. Sometimes it is merely because we've reached a new century, or we've reached a new decade, or we've reached whatever it is. We see that as the threshold of something new. And so all of these other things should come into play. And sometimes it does pull us away from what we really should be about. Kind of interesting, I had seen an article one time written about the comparison of Pius X and the Edwardian era that came about in England. So you see the death of Leo XIII and some other popes before him. around the same time. Leo dies around the same time, give or take a few years, as Queen Victoria. And so in England, you saw this leaving of this old era and this movement forward, and it really was a rush. All of these things kind of moving forward and developing, and yet then there needed to be this kind of pulling back and say, now wait a minute, we need to really examine all of this, and what are the ramifications of all of this technology? What are the ramifications of all of this movement forward? And just as that became a challenge from the Victorian to the Edwardian eras, it becomes a challenge in the church, primarily in Europe, but then into the United States. We see that what Pius is doing is calling us back to understand the roots of our faith. And perhaps out of that calling back to the roots of our faith comes what again is his most modern evolution, our reception of the Eucharist. But it was reminding us that our root is the Eucharist.
The other thing that I find interesting in his life and in his sainthood is that he was canonized in 1954. And prior to that, there weren't many popes that were canonized. And subsequent to that, there weren't many that were canonized. And so he is kind of like singled out as someone whose pontificate was significant not only for Catholicism, but also for the papacy as well. So there's almost this sense that his papacy and his very life was to be an example for his successors. And so, you know, it's interesting because he makes a statement about how his early life was one of being born in poverty and being poor. And that's how he wanted to end his life, in poverty. Not always in the sense of being poor in riches and wealth, but poor in spirit as well. And so there's almost this sense of St. Francis as being part of his life and his ministry. And of course, in our own day and age, we have Pope Francis, who tries and strives to embody the tenets and the practice and the life of St. Francis himself. And so what can we leave the folks before we take a quick break about significance of this Pope being canonized in the 20th century?
Well, as you said, there weren't many that were canonized, and that might shock people. Now there are saints that were early popes, but we reached this long period where there seems to be a drought. And the sad reality is there are many men and women in the church who have begun the process, who perhaps have even been beatified, but we've just reached a point where there's no other way to say it than kind of their bandwagon cause has kind of gone by the wayside, and we've moved on to others, and they may never become saints. What this does for us at the turn of the middle of the 20th century is, as there's another era of modernism, and there's another era of perhaps pulling away from what it is to be faithful and pulling away from the roots of the church, the Holy Father then lifts up one who had to do that 50 years earlier. And then I would say that we see that then another 50 years in Francis canonizing the two saints that we will talk about in the remainder of our show, saying, let's not let this opportunity slip by. We need to seize the moment and lift up this example now. I think Pius was an example that needed lifted up in 1954 and perhaps needs revisited now.
And we're going to take a quick break, but before we do that, we're going to mention to the folks that we are going to talk about Saint Pope John the 23rd and Saint Pope John Paul II. And those the folks that are with us pretty much can resonate with, because I think there are many people that are with us that even remember very intimately the lives of those two saints who we're going to celebrate in just a moment. So please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Light Moments. Here's Father Tom McSweeney.
Recently, people of different ages were asked what they considered the ideal age. 12-year-olds thought 17 was perfect, but 17-year-olds said that they would like to be 19 or 20. The ideal age was always in the future, until people reached their 20s, that is. Then they began thinking that the ideal age was a few years younger than their own. The real problem here is expecting any age to be perfect. Each stage of our lives has its drawbacks and its advantages. If we focus on the positive, any age can be a rewarding one. So don't waste time looking back at some idealized past or longing for some perfect future. Enjoy the beauty of the present moment.
This message from the Christophers, New York, New York 10017. It's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Saint John the 23rd. I have to admit, when we talk about the lives of the popes, he is one whom I've resonated with for years. Especially with his whole sense of humility. Not only the great gift that he gave us with the Vatican Council, but his humble beginnings, his humble life, some of the folklore and antics that took place in his short pontificate that we hear about. He was what many of us would call a very human pope. Let's talk about some of the traits of his life, which were exemplary, that really brought him to open the windows of the church and to not only let in this fresh air, but to rejuvenate us with the sense of the Holy Spirit as well.
Well, I think one of the gifts, and we could argue that it really wasn't anything that John did himself, sometimes it's just being in the right place at the right time. We are a church just a decade after World War II. There's still all this devastation of Europe. There's still vast numbers of refugees. There's still immense poverty. But that is also coupled with all of the developments of technology that really make images and sound readily available to the average person. You no longer have to just go to the movies and see the newsreel. You can turn on a TV at home and you can see the news, and you can see things that have happened halfway across the world. So in being at the right place at the right time, John the 23rd becomes, up till that point, the most accessible pope anyone's ever seen. You couple that with the sense of faith that would have had at that time. Not only would you see him on TV or you'd read about him in newspapers and in magazines, but every Catholic had a picture of the Pope hanging in their home. He was one of the most recognizable people. But that also doesn't take anything away from who he was as a man. You could have put a lesser man in those circumstances and they would not have accomplished the great gifts that he brings. And I think you nailed it when you said that human quality, very down to earth, known for his humor, known for his self-effacing humor, known to just be an average person who wanted to care for the average person.
What's interesting is that his life as a young priest was something that he would not have dreamt that it would have gotten so elevated. He started born in Bergamo. He's a son of peasants. They lived in a farmhouse with their animals, and so there's this sense that early on his whole life was just filled with humble beginnings, and yet once he is ordained, he rises to the sense of a diplomat. He goes into non-Catholic countries like Bulgaria, Turkey, where he learns about other faiths, which has become so important when we talk about the Vatican Council and the ecumenical spirit that he really proposed. And yet there's this whole sense that during this whole time, he doesn't succumb to the trappings of what a diplomat normally does. He has this whole sense of humility. And it's interesting because when we talk about the life of St. John the 23rd, and when he began the Vatican Council, it was almost like the other diplomats and the other hierarchy thought that he was like really joking, that there was no seriousness about what he was going to do, and yet he began this great movement in the church which surprised everybody. And isn't that the sense of God working in humanity, that there's a sense of surprise through it all?
Oh, absolutely. And I think even going back to when you talk about his humble beginnings and his hard work ethic, and taking nothing away from other holy fathers, when we look at the cardinals, and one of the titles given to them are the princes of the church, well, that's not just a fancy title given to this group of men wearing, red garments. Many times, those who were elevated to the role of a cardinal, and even some who became popes, were of noble family. They didn't rise up from peasantry to run the church. They were connected, they had influence, they had wealth and prestige behind them to be educated. But he really gives us a new face of the church, but never losing contact with the church, never losing contact with the people that he is there to serve. And so certainly brings every one of those experiences, whether it's the ecumenical movement, whether it's a greater understanding of the Word of God being shared with our Jewish brethren and with others who can help us understand more about Scripture, the role of Mary, the role of the sacraments in the liturgy, to really have an effect and an influence on people. Going back to kind of the modern technology, he also becomes the first pope of sound bites. Some of the humorous comments we have are little things that are recorded. One of my favorites of his is when he was asked how many people work at the Vatican, and without missing a beat, he said about half. So he had a great sense of humor about him that even played into the whole idea of the Second Vatican Council. There were those who wanted to stop it. Again, talking about power structures. What's this going to mean for the church? What's he going to do? Certainly we see a little of that kind of influencing the church with Pope Francis now. He was to have been told, if you want to do something like this, we just don't have a place to hold everybody. And he says, build one. So he would never let anything get in the way of opening those doors, bringing fresh air into the church, and inviting everybody into the mix. That really is what was perhaps the most amazing aspect of the council, was it brought people from all over. It didn't just bring bishops, it didn't just bring cardinals, it brought lay people who were recognized as being experts in their field to offer, to build up and strengthen the church.
Well, it's interesting because of the 16 documents of Vatican II that were promulgated, beginning with his pontificate and then subsequently with Paul VI, that it covered the whole gamut of human life, from the church itself to the non-Catholics to those who do not believe in God. So there's this whole sense that truly God is working in the world, and it's the church who is the spokesperson for God. And we have to remind ourselves that it's not the Catholic Church, it's the Church of Jesus Christ, which is the Catholic Church. And so this whole sense that the church in this time and space is speaking to the world today. And he was the human catalyst through the power of the Spirit that opened wide the windows and the doors of a church that we celebrate today. We're going to take a quick break and talk about the life of another saint. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her. Instead of sitting on the couch, I hope to clean up.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say thinking of her and the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together?
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. But she's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about a pope who was significant, Pope John Paul II, who beatified and canonized probably more saints than anyone in the history of the Church. We ended with talking about St. John the 23rd and how through his pontificate and the gift of the Spirit, he opened wide the doors and the windows of the Church to let in this fresh air and this renewal of the Spirit. We have in the life of John Paul II, whose long pontificate also was significant in the Jubilee year, where he opened wide the doors of the Church. You were ordained around that time. Tell us what was significant for you.
Well, I would say 5 years in seminary, the last 3 years, really, there was so much talk about the coming of the third millennium and the Great Jubilee, and then, of course, John Paul dedicated different years to different aspects of God, and then, of course, the year 2000, which I was ordained in the year of the Great Jubilee. It was a time of a great sense of hope and promise and renewal for the Church, but then also that sense that the Church doesn't just do anything overnight. I remember being in seminary and them telling us, well, don't get too used to the words of the liturgy because they're, in the process of reforming all of that. Well, I was ordained 11 years before that translation came into being. But there was still that renewal and that excitement. It might take time to develop and to unfold, but I think the Church at that time was very much embodying that renewed spirit. And I think even in being able to talk about him as a saint, having been able to talk about John the 23rd as a saint, we haven't talked about Paul VI, but being beatified and on the way to sainthood, oftentimes seen as the hinge between these two pontificates. The creator of the Second Vatican Council, Paul VI, kind of lives it out, and then John Paul II, what do you do with it now on the promise of a third millennium? How do we take all this? We don't just do it overnight. How does this get lived out? And so we see in his pontificate that how do you take everything that we've just done as a church and re-examined in the council, and it didn't end in 68 or 69. How are we in 2000 living all of this? How are we really putting it into practice? And I think that was the great challenge of his pontificate, how to prepare us for the third millennium.
Well, when we look at the Vatican Council, we've just celebrated really just 50 years of it. And many theologians say that it probably will be in the next 100, maybe a couple hundred years, when its full impact and fruition will really actually be realized. And so that says something to us and about us as a church, that we continue to evolve, we continue to grow. And in the life of Pope John Paul II, whose long pontificate embodied so many different aspects of the church, when it came to either writing encyclicals or making pronouncements of the faith, or canonizing and beatifying holy men and women. His whole pontificate was such that in well over a quarter of a century, he embodied many things that very few popes have throughout their own pontificate. And what do you think would be some of his legacy as not only as a saint, but as a human being and as a pontiff?
Well, my fear first is that in that long pontificate, we forget the youthful, energetic Pope jumping on and off of airplanes, bounding down the steps and kissing the ground of whatever land he had come to visit. And for many of us, it's been replaced with that image of an older, sick gentleman, but who still was teaching us and still was offering us great wisdom. So putting all of that together, all 27 years, I think he himself said it with the book, The Threshold of Hope. I think if you want to pick one word, you can scrutinize theological and ecclesial aspects of his pontificate, but I think there always was that great sense of hope. Hope for the future, hope for this life in Christ. I recently had done a 3-day talk, and I was trying to find a topic that hadn't been exhausted too much, and so I looked at our 3 most recent popes of John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Francis, and I took those virtues of faith, hope, and love, and really saw, of course, Benedict, the protector of the faith, and we hear a great deal about Francis, love, charity, caritas, but the hope was really what John Paul wanted to impart to people. And that in order to have that hope come to fruition, there are challenges we have to accept, we have to embrace, and we have to overcome. You can't just run around being in love with the idea of hope. You have to work for it. And I think that's probably his greatest legacy, is that we cannot just expect or assume or be entitled. There is hope, but we have to work for it.
What's interesting is that his election in 1978, being the first non-Italian pope in well over 400 years, would have given a sense of hope to a church that was really kind of still stuck in European times, and the sense of that the church is larger than what is at the Vatican. And so, and I think he embodied that in his own pontificate by singling out men and women of different times and ages to beatify, to declare as a saint, that their lives were such that they could point others to Christ, in that his life pointed others to Christ. It's interesting because when many people think of John Paul II, they would hearken back to those last few years of his pontificate, as you had mentioned. We do forget about him being elected at a very young age, but yet we remember his old age, his frailty, his illnesses, his sickness. It almost puts humanity in the life of someone that we would revere as almost a living saint. And at his funeral, how they would yell, "Santo subito, make him a saint immediately." So that was hearkened and listened to by his successor, and he was canonized along with John the 23rd by Pope Francis in 2014, and we celebrate their lives. When we talk about the saints and we talk about the popes, we talk about ourselves as well. We talk about the church and how important it is for us in this time, in this place, to try to be saints in this modern world. We thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.